Let's go to Adelaide and catch up with former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. Alexander, good to catch up with you again. I'm keen to get your thoughts on the coalition announcing that we ought to get our ambassador back to Kiev in Ukraine, currently out of country. They're making this an election promise. Many other countries have still got their embassies open in the Ukrainian capital. We should be there, shouldn't we?
Yes, there's obviously some risk involved. It's relatively low, but it sends the wrong message if we scurry away because we're concerned that we don't support Ukraine. I think we should give strong support to Ukraine. We kept an embassy in Afghanistan when I was the foreign minister. We had one in Baghdad. There were risks involved, but they weren't very high, but there were risks. But the symbolism of pulling your embassy out, in the case of Ukraine, there's 70 or so countries have embassies there and we don't. I think it's almost embarrassing. It shows a lack of support for Ukraine. Yeah,
it's understandable that they evacuated in the early days of the Russian invasion. Most did, but so many got back there pretty quickly and re-established a beachhead. We've had so many world leaders and even celebrities turn up in Kiev to have meetings and press conferences with President Zelensky.
Yes, of course. And our ministers and senior officials of one kind or another have visited Ukraine. But the symbolism of Australia not having an embassy there and yet 70 countries having an embassy there, us not having an ambassador on the ground, it's embarrassing. It makes us look weak.
Now, I must be in a really depressed state of funk because with Adelaide out of the finals, because on Monday night I punished myself by watching Q&A. And I want to show you something that was said by someone you know well, former Attorney General George Brandis, who went on to become High Commissioner in London, as you do, as you were. So he has some knowledge of foreign affairs. And here's what he said about the potential of President Trump returning to the White House.
I do regard Trump, particularly what Trump's foreign policy would look like, frankly, as a real danger to the West. He, in my view, would on day one throw Zelensky under a bus. Mm-hmm. He would send a signal to Putin that Putin can get away with what he liked. And does anybody seriously think that if Putin received that signal, he wouldn't chance his hand somewhere like in the Baltic states? And if that were to happen, does anybody believe that Trump would defend the Baltic states? Of course he wouldn't.
Alexander Downer, could George Brandis be any more wrong?
Well, I don't think for a minute President Trump, if he becomes the president again, will throw President Zelensky, more importantly the people of Ukraine, under a bus. I think what he'll do is go to the Russians and make to the Russians a very clear point, and that is that he will continue to arm to the extent it is necessary the Ukrainians to ensure they can win the war. And so what the Russians would be best advised to do is start negotiating a ceasefire. I think that would be his approach. That's not a danger to anyone. I think the advantage of, there are disadvantages of a President Trump regime, but the advantage is that in dealing with Russia, in dealing with Iran and dealing with China, he would be strong and decisive. He wouldn't be running this line, well, we've got to be careful not to escalate and so on. He would say to the Iranians, you stop arming and supporting these proxies who are trying to destroy Israel, and you support a two-state solution, and then we can have peace in the Middle East. But if you don't do that, we will confront you and talk about different ways of confronting Iran. And with China, it's quite simple. Don't mess around in the South China Sea in breach of international law, and don't put your hands on Taiwan. And then we can coexist quite comfortably with each other. But I think we need a president of the United States who's strong and decisive. I think when he was the president before, Trump was that.
Exactly.
So I think
History bears that out.
Of Trump. There's a downside, right?
There is a downside. We haven't got time to go through that now, but thanks for telling us that George Brandis was completely wrong without saying George Brandis was completely wrong. Thanks for joining us, Alexander Downer there.